Hello and welcome. This is the week leading up to a convention held in Atlanta every year called Mystic South. This will be my third time attending. It is a great place to find out what people in the spiritual and mystical community are up to. A lot of research is discussed and presented at this conference. It is put together by a combination of Cherry Hill Seminary and Llewellyn Publishing. So there's a lot of focus on what's been written about, things that people are working with, new research that's out there, and how people are incorporating it into our practices. So for somebody who is both deeply spiritual and more on the nerdy intellectual side of things, it is a lot of fun for me to be there, to meet people and discuss what folks have been thinking about and sort of unraveling to see what they can do with it in real life. It's always an exciting time. But leading up to that, it always puts me in a pretty introspective position. I'm going to be around people who are coming from wildly different perspectives on spiritual life than what I have. And that's not to say that I expect there to be a lot of disagreements or conflict, but there's usually a lot of linguistic negotiation that has to go on for us to figure out if we're talking about the same things or different things, or exactly what words are going to make the most sense considering how distant some of these traditions can be culturally, in forms of language, in terms of what traditions do what and why. And that in itself teaches me a lot in figuring out what are we doing together as humanity in a spiritual sense. Because there is always this overarching theme that we are all there to do our best regardless of the tools that we're using. So it always has me thinking a lot about myself, where I'm coming from, how I'm going to tell my story this year, how I am different from when I attended in previous years. And every single time I go, it gives me kind of a catapult into new things that I need to incorporate, perspectives that I need to think about, more work and projects for me to take on in my own spiritual development. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about where I have come from and why I use the methods that I'm using now in order to get to the processes, the tools that I'm offering here on this channel. I started my spiritual life at a very young age. My parents had grown up Catholic, but they wanted to bring me up Jehovah's Witness. It was a big difference culturally and socially for them, which is what they wanted. They really had no idea what they were getting me into. So I learned to read with a book of Bible stories and a recording on tape and the help of Sesame Street. And it was using that biblical literature that I had my initial deep experiences with reading and thinking through language. That's always been a powerful link for me. And most of my young life was committed to the Jehovah's Witness community that we were a part of. However, my dad watched Hercules movies, and we would watch old Viking-themed movies and this adventurous stuff that presented ideas of gods that were not the deity that Jehovah's Witnesses were worshiping. And I got curious, so I would read about all of that old mythology, all of these deities. I was very curious about what those ideas were and how they were still so powerful if, my concept of general culture was that everybody was Christian, so why were we still talking about this stuff? Was it just historical, or was there more meat to it? And as I got older, even as a committed Christian at the time, I had a lot of questions about the Bible itself. It was very obvious to me that the different documents that compose the Bible came from different time periods, different peoples and attitudes. It was more than just a difference in authors. There were differences in perspectives and the whole environment that the literature had come out of. And I got more and more curious about not just those documents alone, because I studied them a lot, I knew a lot about them, but it became really obvious to me as a person who liked writing and literature that a piece of writing, a document, doesn't just come out of nowhere. It is always referring to other models of writing, other ways of organizing information that are current in its time, that it is either trying to improve on or add to, or flatly contradict and say, oh, this writing over here, everybody knows about it, but it's totally wrong. This is the truth, and that's why I'm writing this. In many ways, the history of spiritual documentation in the ancient Near East was a lot of public letter writing in an argumentative sense. Oh, I see what you're doing over there, but this is the real truth. And scribes all over the ancient Near East were engaging in this mostly to appease and comfort the anxieties and desires of kings, satraps, local governors, people with real power. So there was always this sort of tension between the political and the spiritual in the ancient world that all of the books of the Bible came from. So this, of course, got me more interested in politics and power relations, and well, if later on in my life, if deities are interacting in these spaces and they have stakes in what happens, they're transmitting information not just out of a sense of, as a deity, I'm going to tell this prophet what is true, and then the prophet will tell the truth to everybody else, and they better believe it, but more in a sense of, if I as a deity release this information to this prophet, it is going to change the attitudes and the general consensus of the people in these ways. I'm going to nudge them in this direction so that the energy of this social community will shift over time. The deities are much wiser about what information they release and how they do it than humans, so it may not be as direct or complete as some of us would hope, but it still has its effect every single time. So a big part of my spiritual study began with document comparison. Looking not just for mythologies, but also anything that scribes related to temples would have produced, how that would have positioned them politically, and also how those documents may have influenced other documents that cropped up within the next 100 years or so, and this continuation of a conversation that was going on between people who were writing, especially about spiritual stuff. And that's a lot of the reason that I got my master's in religious studies, was I wanted more access to that research. I wanted to know how scholars were thinking about it. I knew I needed more linguistic information about, if they use this word, what other concepts does it relate to? Do we know anything about the nuance or metaphor that is presented by that word? So always this interest in language and spirituality. How do we talk about the spiritual world in a way that is effective for us and helps us form a relationship with it that is respectful to it, but also has significant meaning in our own lives? We don't want to just turn language into something that portrays a spiritual world that we have nothing to do with and can't touch. We want to make sure that our language is creating a link, even though it is very much a human thing. Do the spirits bless this use of language, and will they allow us to have a relationship with them using these terms? That was always an important piece of it for me, because there did seem to be a lot of sticky mixture between the way that people saw politics and the way they saw spirituality, because the scribes knew that if the temple was going to remain and have any kind of leverage over popular life at all, that the kings had to be cool with what the temple was doing. So the more that the temple could make spiritual life seem like the king had some control over it, and it had a lot to do with the success of the king and what the king wanted, those who ran the temple knew that as long as that relationship went well, they would get the resources that they needed in order to continue to serve the gods and be a part of society. Could those relationships become incestuous and corrupt? Of course they could. But again, that tension, that negotiation, as far as we know from the documents that we have, that tension has existed before the documents existed. So as far as what knowledge we have inherited in that way, it's always been a theme of spiritual literature. And even if we go back to the mythology that describes the world before human life and current society, we find that a lot of these intermeshings of political ideology and spiritual ideology are influencing the perspective on how the world came to be. And all of this was in the forefront of my mind as I was trying to figure out, in this tradition that I've inherited that goes back to the ancient Middle East, the ancient Near East, how do I continue that tradition in a way that is fully respectful to the deities as I understand them, especially as a person who feels very uncomfortable giving authority and power to humans and thinking that they're going to use it in a way that fully respects the deities. I worry a lot that that relationship has become completely unhinged. And really, much of my concern about helping people develop healthier spirituality is rooted in my looking around at our current political landscape and feeling like it's not satisfactory. We don't feel connected to the machinery of community and the way that things get done that affect our lives in a way that our voices are heard, and we know that there is this direct conduit from the needs of community to the structures that make those communities work and set up how they work. So since I saw such a strong disconnect there, I thought, well, if people can develop a deeper relationship with spirit, this will necessarily encourage them to form better community. Because as you get deeper and deeper into spiritual work, it becomes so crystal clear that the work that you're doing is not just about you and your position and your personal needs and your psychological development. It is also about how you connect to the world around you, to the people around you. And one of the reasons that I focused so much on tarot as a primary tool is that, one, it encourages people to think about the cards together, and that they have a meaning that has lots of layers of depth, and for two people to discuss and tease out those layers, what they mean to them, you both get a little spiritual lesson from one another that you can work into something that's a little more objective. But then you also get each one of your personal positions. You have a chance to work on the language that you want to use for that, get some information from this other person that may offer you another perspective. It's this chance to grow, but also connect. And one-on-one readings do that. A pair of people just playing with the cards and having a conversation around them does that. And I host and encourage people to have gatherings where you're talking about tarot cards together. And in this way, you're bringing up all these different perspectives on meaning, ways to think about life. And when you talk about these things that are important to you and that affect you on many layers, you're forming community too. You start talking about your more practical needs and the things that affect your day-to-day life. Spirituality connects us necessarily. It's a part of our social and communal lifeblood that, frankly, we have not been encouraged to take responsibility for and care for in the way that has proven to be best for us as human groups. And that's just based on research of what kind of living situations humans in general find lead to happiness and a fulfilling life. Generally, it's not one where you feel totally disconnected from your spiritual life, your communal life. You are alienated and, in some sense, can do whatever you want as long as it doesn't involve anybody else on a deeply personal level. That does not respect the spiritual world around us or our individual needs in a deep sense, and it certainly doesn't allow us to grow in an expansive and joyous way. So, what I have taken on as part of my spiritual job is to help folks understand this transmission of spiritual history, to separate concepts in spirituality that root you in authority, that restrict what you're capable of doing, and that turn you into something that is easily controlled, but rather to sponsor spiritualities that encourage us to communicate, that give us tools for a deep personal relationship with the spirits of the land around us, the spirits of community that we need in order to function together, and using tarot as a way to get to common symbols, common language, a mode of transmission that is survivable and that in itself contains a lot of spiritual wisdom that has been refined over the ages. I could have picked a lot of different tools, but partly because I'm crazy about cards, I feel like visual learning and conversation about visual things opens up a lot more opportunity even than conversation about texts. And also focusing on a visual medium means that our language can be continually flexible. That because we're not discussing a paragraph and what did the author really mean, instead we're looking at an image and saying, well, what do you associate this image with? It activates the part of our mind that interprets art rather than the part that is strictly logical. And that is a healthy way and has continued to be an inspiring way for us to engage with spiritual themes. So hopefully that gives you a little idea of my arc, why I draw a lot from first ancient Near Eastern symbols and concepts that influenced Greek thinking that was spread all around the world through Alexander, that then eventually came to be part of how the Roman Empire set its standards for public worship and what was okay to do in a spiritual sense, but then that also made that into a strictly authoritative system organized around the emperor, and how that was taken over by the official authorized Christian church that came on much, much later than the early Christian Gnostics. And then how that church, as it took over Europe, splintered into different concepts, different ideologies, eventually focused more on text than community as the Reformation split off and people became much more invested in religion as something with a textual basis. And then now has come to our sense of studying, well, where did all this stuff come from? What other voices have we missed by focusing so much on what was written down in letters? And what do we truly need out of all of these tools that our ancestors have explored? What's going to help us most in this current moment? And how can we continually be forming healthy, thriving spiritual community that will truly fulfill our individual needs and the hope, the joy that keeps us going and keeps us transforming? So thank you very much for listening. Hopefully this gives you a clearer idea of what concepts I'm going to be drawing on if you come to me for spiritual assistance, help doing things like creating rituals, finding the best traditions for you, and also the breadth of spiritual perspective that I bring to the readings that I offer. I really want to make sure that I'm speaking your language and that I'm finding the right themes for you to be working on in your moment that will provide you with longer term progress and things you can continue to work out as you develop. Have a fabulous day. I can't wait to get to Mystic South this weekend. We're going to have a great time, and I'm sure that I'll have lots more to share based on what I learned. Take care.